One morning in the spring of 1986, a 46-year-old Canadian woman named Alina Atkinson softly closed the door to her teenage son Jacob's bedroom. Jacob had recently been in a terrible car accident and was bedridden with his injuries. Doctors had told Alina and her husband Tyler that Jacob would require around-the-clock care to recuperate, and so even though Alina had a very busy professional career as a biologist, she had taken a leave of absence to tend to her son. It had been a very abrupt life change for her, but she was grateful she was even able to do that. However, Jacob, luckily, was healing faster than doctors expected, and so now he just spent most of his time in bed, not needing any direct care from Alina. That left Alina with a lot of hours during the day to kinda do nothing. She didn't really need to look after her son, and her husband was away most of the day in Vancouver at the university where he taught mathematics. And so for a while, Alina had spent this unexpected free time reading or just playing the piano. But then she had found her old paint set from high school in the garage. As a teenager, Alina had been an avid painter. And so she figured, with all this extra free time, maybe now is a good time to rekindle her passion. Now, initially, she painted homes, buildings, and churches in a realistic architectural style. But in the last couple of weeks, she'd been experimenting with painting new things and using new brushwork techniques. And for some reason, as she was trying out new things, she became obsessed with strawberries. It was like every time she painted a strawberry, the more obsessed with them she became. She found an almost infinite subtlety in every detail of its form. The spacing of the seeds, the specific shade of red, the tuft of green petals at the top. It was like every time she sat down to paint, she would consider painting other subjects, but she just couldn't get the strawberries out of her mind, and so she would just paint more strawberries. Now, Alina didn't know if this meant anything, but she didn't question it. She just did what her brain told her to do. 1 year later, on a warm summer night, Alina stood with her husband in a brightly lit white rectangular room. It was the opening night of her first solo art show at a local Vancouver gallery. Tyler tapped his plastic cup of white wine against hers and whistled in awe at the walls filled with her amazing artwork. The paintings were filled with detail. There were paintings of houses ringed in seas of brightly colored flowers, with every petal carefully shaded. There were these kaleidoscopic circular paintings of roots and mushrooms and octopuses. And there were paintings of leaves and bark and tropical fish, all rendered in a similarly obsessive way. They were undoubtedly beautiful, but full of so much detail, it almost looked kind of manic. Now, Alina didn't really understand where this intense creative drive was coming from. I mean, she had wanted to get back into painting, but didn't expect to be so head over heels in love with it again. But she was very proud of what she'd made. Months earlier, when Jacob had recovered enough to return to high school, Alina realized something big. She didn't want to go back to her old life. She used to love working as a biologist, but now, compared to how she felt while she was painting, it was awful, and she couldn't go back. And so Alina had quit her job and spent every day since obsessively creating art. The process was thrilling to her, and it kept expanding. Alina didn't want to do anything else. Sometimes her husband seemed a bit bewildered by her devotion to her craft, but Alina didn't mind. She felt too inspired to care. Just then, the director of the gallery interrupted the couple's moment with good news. Several of Alina's paintings had just sold. Her show was a hit. Seven years later, on a drizzly winter morning in 1994, Alina was in the kitchen making toast and envisioning her day in the art studio. The house was quiet, except for a small radio that Alina kept tuned to the classical music station. And after a while, she realized she'd been listening to the same piece of music for what felt like a really long time. She stared at the radio and focused on what she was hearing. The song was a strange hypnotic march with a rolling staccato snare drum carrying a melody of flutes and bells. Across almost 15 minutes, the song swelled and snowballed, adding more and more instruments until it crescendoed in a bombastic parade of sound and then crashed into silence. When the music finally stopped, the DJ identified the song as Bolero by the French composer Maurice Ravel, composed in 1928. Alina had never felt so moved by a piece of music ever in her life. Something about this bolero had affected her in a profound way. She poured herself a mug of tea and then hurried to the studio. She had an idea. 3 weeks later, Alina perched on a stool in her studio with a brush in her hand, her face inches from the canvas. On the shelf by the window, her CD player was switched to repeat mode to play the same track over and over, which was, of course, Ravel's Bolero. It was the only music Alina had listened to for weeks. It was also the subject of her latest painting that she had been working on for weeks. The painting was supposed to be a visual representation of the song Bolero. Each note was depicted as a different color. For instance, B-flat was metallic green. The duration of the song was expressed as a series of rectangles stacked on top of each other. The height of each shape represented the loudness of the instruments. Alina listened to Bolero hundreds and hundreds of times to create her visual coding system. This required an extreme level of focus, but Alina had never felt so inspired. She felt like she was making her masterpiece. The most challenging part, though, was translating the climax of Bolero to painting. During the climax, the music becomes dense and dramatic, with crashing drums and instruments overlapping with one another. Alina conveyed this chaos by making her map of shapes and colors grow larger and larger and then start to sort of fall apart, like a scarf unraveling. And one night, while staring at the painting, the title of it came to her. She called it Unraveling Bolero. 6 years later, on a weekend afternoon in the year 2000, Tyler was making lunch for his wife. Unraveling Bolero had become a small sensation in the art world, and since its release, Alina's career had steadily grown. After knocking on his wife's studio door, Tyler nudged it open and went inside. As always, Alina was in front of her easel with a large palette of paints beside her. Tyler asked her what she wanted for lunch, but at first, she didn't seem to hear him. When he asked again, she simply blurted out a string of words. Sandwich, apple, tea. Back in the kitchen, Tyler kept thinking about Alina's response. He had noticed his wife had seemed less talkative lately, but he had assumed she was just lost in thoughts about her work. Now, he wasn't so sure. A year later, Tyler's brother and wife were visiting from out of state for the holidays. Tyler asked Alina to take a break from painting so they could spend some time together, and she had agreed. While Tyler waited for her to finish up in the studio, he opened up a bottle of wine and lit a fire in the fireplace. When Alina emerged and joined them, Tyler's brother asked her what she'd been working on. Alina opened her mouth to explain, but then she just cocked her head to the side as if she was trying to remember what she was going to say. Then, instead of actually speaking, she began tracing a triangular shape in the air, like she was playing a game of charades. Tyler couldn't tell if his wife was just being playful or something, but he translated for her. He explained to his brother that Alina's new painting was of some friends on vacation in Egypt, in front of the pyramids, hence the triangle. Now, Alina would eventually regain her speech, and so everyone just kind of forgot about this weird moment, but Tyler didn't. He kept thinking about the way Alina had become momentarily speechless. He couldn't help but feel like something was happening to his wife. He just didn't understand what. Another year later, one evening in the fall of 2002, Tyler went into Alina's studio to discuss their dinner plans for the night. He suggested a couple of local spots, then asked if she had a craving for anything specific. And he watched as Alina didn't answer him, and then she began to furrow her brow and began to look really frustrated. Tyler asked her again, thinking maybe she hadn't heard him or didn't understand, but this time his wife just grabbed a pad of paper and began sketching something. Seconds later, she held up a drawing of a hamburger. At this point, Tyler was genuinely disturbed. This no longer felt like maybe his wife being eccentric. It seemed like his wife, again, was suddenly unable to talk. And so, acting on instinct, he told his wife he was going to call her doctor. And Alina simply nodded and turned back to her canvas. A few weeks later, a neurologist named Dr. Brad Milhauser sat in his office in San Francisco, across from Alina and Tyler, who had traveled all the way from Canada to see him. Dr. Milhauser's specialty was treating unusual brain conditions. He listened while Tyler described what was going on with his wife. As for Alina, she just sat there quietly watching her husband speak. She could no longer string together phrases longer than 3 or 4 words, and so Tyler had become the family's default spokesperson. Tyler told Dr. Milhauser about his wife's sudden career change, from cellular biologist to artist. and her gradual loss of language that followed. When expressing herself visually, Alina was vivid and creative, but when using language, Alina had become totally confused. As Tyler explained the evolution of Alina's artwork, he listed some of her favorite subject matter: houses, flowers, strawberries, and bolero. Alina brightened at the mention of bolero. She quickly reached for a pen and notepad on the desk and began sketching an outline of her painting. Dr. Milhauser watched as Alina carefully rendered each square and triangle in precise proportions. He was impressed by how tunnel-visioned her focus became when locked into her work. But her specific fascination with bolero gave him an idea. Dr. Milhauser had actually studied Maurice Ravel before, the artist behind the piece Bolero. But he had studied him from a medical perspective, not a musical one. The doctor had a hunch that the parallel between the famed French composer and Alina might run deeper than anyone realized. While Alina continued sketching, Dr. Milhauser told her husband that he wanted to do some brain scans on Alina. If what he suspected was true, Maurice Ravel could be the clue to her mysterious condition. Days later, after studying the results of Alina's brain scans, Dr. Milhauser knew he had been correct. Alina's diagnosis was a brain disease known as frontotemporal dementia. Alina's brain scan showed significant damage to her frontal cortex, which is the part of the brain responsible for speech and language. When cells in the frontal cortex begin to wither and die, language skills quickly decline. What causes frontotemporal dementia is not still fully known, but some doctors think it's due to the buildup of abnormal proteins in the brain. One surprising side effect of this disease is that as the language processing part of the brain weakens, other areas sometimes become stronger to compensate. For instance, the part related to processing visual information or the area that processes sound can become much sharper, leading to unexpected surges of creativity. But these bursts can express themselves in extreme or obsessive ways, such as repeating a single idea over and over again, like Alina's paintings of countless strawberries, or Maurice Ravel's Bolero, which repeats the first melody 9 times. What Dr. Milhauser knew from his studies was that Maurice Ravel also suffered from frontotemporal dementia. In 1933, 6 years after composing Bolero, Ravel's mental health began deteriorating. Within 2 years, Ravel couldn't write or speak. Although brain scanning technology didn't exist during Ravel's lifetime, a French surgeon examined the composer's brain just before his death in 1937. In his notes, the surgeon described 2 of the lobes in Ravel's brain as being sunken. Ravel and Alina's unraveling were almost identical. A spike of artistic vision followed by a sudden loss of language. The fact that Alina based her most famous painting on Bolero was the clue to her diagnosis, but it was also a cosmically strange coincidence. Despite identifying Alina's condition, there was unfortunately nothing that doctors could do to reverse it. She gradually lost control of the entire right side of her body, and then she entirely lost the ability to talk or even understand words. All the while, Alina continued to paint. But by 2005, Alina's body had degenerated so badly that she finally stopped painting. And then 2 years after that, Alina Atkinson died. Almost 70 years to the month after her inspiration, Maurice Ravel, also died. To this day, her painting, Unraveling Bolero, hangs in Dr. Milhauser's office, a fitting place for a work of art that reminds us how huge a role brain activity plays in creativity. And now for our second story, called Crossing Over. One morning in September of 2019, a 33-year-old man named Daniel Flores stumbled into the lobby of a busy emergency room in Boston, Massachusetts. He was delirious, soaked in sweat, and clutching his stomach in obvious pain. As he waited in line to sign in, Daniel's chest started to heave. All of a sudden, he could barely breathe. Before he could call for help, his vision turned blurry, and he collapsed to the floor. Moments later, he felt people lifting him up, placing him in a wheelchair, and rushing him through a series of swinging doors. The hospital swirled around him in a haze of voices, bodies, and fluorescent lights as someone placed an oxygen mask over his mouth. Soon, Daniel found himself lying on a bed in a small room while a man in a white coat spoke to him. Daniel assumed he was the doctor, but he wasn't sure because Daniel didn't speak English. The doctor seemed to realize Daniel was not understanding him, so he stepped out into the hallway and yelled something, and Daniel caught one familiar word: Español. Soon, a young male nurse hurried into the room and introduced himself in Spanish. He said that he would be Daniel's interpreter. After grabbing a clipboard off the counter, the nurse asked Daniel how long he'd been experiencing his symptoms. Daniel removed his oxygen mask and told him that he'd been feeling nauseous ever since arriving in Massachusetts 4 days ago with his wife and kids. And then once they had actually gotten to Boston 2 days earlier, it had only gotten worse, and he had begun coughing up blood. At first, it had been bright red, but over the past 2 days, the blood had only gotten darker. This morning, before coming to the hospital, the blood looked brown and gritty, almost like coffee grounds. The interpreter nodded and relayed this information to the doctor. The doctor listened intently, then said something to the interpreter. The interpreter then turned to Daniel and asked him about his medical history. Specifically, he wanted to know if Daniel smoked, drank, or took drugs. Daniel hesitated to tell the truth, but he decided he would trust the interpreter. He admitted that although he had recently quit, for 15 years, Daniel had smoked a pack of cigarettes a day. He also drank daily, at least 2 or 3 drinks. After this, the interpreter and the doctor began speaking to each other. Daniel obviously didn't know what they were saying, but their voices sounded serious, which made him feel nervous. Eventually, the interpreter turned back to Daniel. He told Daniel that coughing up blood often indicates bleeding inside of the digestive tract, which can be life-threatening. In order to find out more, the doctor wanted to run some tests, and Daniel agreed. After the doctor left to go arrange the tests, the interpreter flipped to a new page of Daniel's patient intake form, and his next question was about Daniel's family history. However, Daniel really didn't want to answer. He knew that if right now he said the wrong thing, he and his family could be in a lot of trouble with immigration officials. About an hour later, Dr. Nicholas Hunt opened up an image on his computer. He was studying an X-ray the lab had just sent him of a new patient, Daniel Flores. After conducting a physical exam where he noticed that Daniel was feverish, had trouble breathing, and had a heart rate that was higher than normal, Daniel had also flinched when Dr. Hunt pressed on his abdomen. It seemed to him that Daniel's body was breaking down in several ways simultaneously, but he wasn't sure why. Dr. Hunt knew he would need to narrow down the options before Daniel's symptoms worsened. As Dr. Hunt examined the X-ray, he couldn't help but feel like the image was pretty worrying. Both of Daniel's lungs looked patchy and opaque. That meant they were infected, possibly with pneumonia, or even something more serious. As a precaution, Dr. Hunt put Daniel on a regimen of broad-spectrum antibiotics that would hopefully slow any infection while Dr. Hunt figured out what was wrong. Just then, the doctor got another email. It was another test result from the lab, Daniel's blood test, and none of it was good news. The test indicated that Daniel had low levels of sodium and potassium, which suggested mild kidney damage. Daniel's liver enzyme levels were much higher than they should have been too, which meant he also might have liver damage, possibly from years of daily drinking. Daniel showed high levels of a type of white blood cell called neutrophils, which are part of the immune system's response to infections. And so it looked to Dr. Hunt like Daniel's body was trying to fight something off. But his long years of drinking and smoking had very likely left his immune system dangerously weakened. It was clear to Dr. Hunt that the clock was ticking for Daniel Flores. He wanted to help, but he still didn't know what he was up against. Dr. Hunt shared Daniel's test results with a colleague, an internist named Marissa Kaneko. Dr. Hunt had already forwarded her Daniel's medical file so that she could help determine if Daniel's kidney or liver damage might be causing internal bleeding. Dr. Kaneko said she found Daniel's lab results equally worrying, and the source of the bleeding needed to be found quickly. And so she recommended to Dr. Hunt that Daniel have either a bronchoscopy or an upper endoscopy, so the doctors could have a look inside of him. A bronchoscopy is a procedure that uses a thin, flexible tube mounted with a camera, called a bronchoscope, to examine the lungs and throat. An upper endoscopy would be similar, but would examine the digestive tract. Dr. Hunt agreed with her idea. 1 hour later, Dr. Kaneko stood above Daniel in the operating room, gently guiding the bronchoscope down his throat as her sedated patient lay perfectly still. She watched the bronchoscope's progress on a small monitor positioned above Daniel's bed. As the tube found its way inside of Daniel's lungs, Dr. Kaneko saw streaks of dark red lining the inside. It's what she was afraid of finding. They were bloody secretions from decades of heavy smoking. Dr. Kaneko maneuvered the bronchoscope as delicately as possible to collect fluid samples for testing. But even the softest touch of the scope against Daniel's lung tissue triggered even more bleeding. On the monitor, she could see blood was actually oozing from the tiny air sacs in the lungs called alveoli. This was clearly more than damage from just smoking. Something else was causing Daniel's lungs to hemorrhage blood. If she couldn't identify the cause, Daniel could easily bleed to death. However, there were a lot of options to weed out. This type of hemorrhaging was a common symptom of many infectious diseases, from something common like pneumonia to rare autoimmune conditions such as vasculitis and Goodpasture syndrome, and even a potentially fatal condition called acute respiratory distress syndrome. Dr. Kaneko carefully retracted the bronchoscope up and out of Daniel's esophagus. Then a nurse wheeled Daniel back to his room. At this point, the doctor had successfully confirmed that there was something critically wrong with Daniel, putting him in immediate danger of death. However, that knowledge didn't put them any closer to finding a cure. That night, after making the rounds to visit his other patients, Dr. Hunt returned to Daniel's room. Daniel's skin was now yellowish, a sign that his liver was failing, and his eyelids drooped. He looked exhausted, and frankly, much worse than he had looked during the bronchoscopy only a few hours earlier. Dr. Hunt wrapped a blood pressure cuff around Daniel's bicep. He inflated it, then watched the gauge while listening to Daniel's blood flow with his stethoscope. He tried not to show any outward signs of worry on his face when he saw that Daniel's blood pressure had dropped significantly. Dr. Hunt also noticed Daniel's breathing had become raspy and shallow. He placed his stethoscope on Daniel's chest and listened. Between breaths, he heard a brittle, crackling sound, which indicated fluid building up in Daniel's lungs. All of Daniel's organs seemed to be losing the battle against whatever was attacking them. Dr. Hunt decided to run an emergency blood test to check on his patient's failing kidneys. This time, the news was even worse. Daniel's kidneys had shut down. Dr. Hunt immediately ordered Daniel to be put on dialysis. Without working kidneys to filter his body's waste, Daniel could develop a condition called uremia, which can lead to seizures, comas, and often death. A nurse promptly wheeled Daniel's bed to an operating room where a surgeon would connect the dialysis machine while Dr. Hunt's mind raced to figure out what was wrong with Daniel. And he knew he did not have much time left. A few hours later, Dr. Hunt sipped a cup of lukewarm coffee as Daniel lay nearly unconscious while a dialysis machine filtered his blood. Dr. Hunt felt tired and confused. Daniel's symptoms were so extensive and serious that it was difficult to narrow it down to a single cause. Dr. Hunt had ordered lab technicians to run tests for Daniel of virtually every autoimmune disease, but the results kept coming back negative. Early the following morning, the on-duty nurse notified Dr. Hunt that Daniel's oxygen levels had plummeted. His lungs were now too weak to process oxygen. If it went on much longer, the lack of oxygen in Daniel's blood would cause permanent damage to his brain. Dr. Hunt ordered Daniel to be intubated to help with his breathing and then transferred to the ICU. In the 24 hours since Daniel had stumbled into the hospital, his condition had only grown steadily worse. If Dr. Hunt didn't come up with something quick, it was unlikely Daniel would survive much longer. Alejandra Flores could not believe her eyes when she walked into the ICU. Her husband Daniel was unconscious, hooked up to a room full of machines with tubes in his arms and down his throat. He was unable to speak. He looked more dead than alive. The day before, when Daniel had told her he was going to the hospital, Alejandra agreed that he did seem sick, but she assumed it was just a bad flu, or at least it was just something that could be treated, so she didn't go with him. But when she didn't hear from him by that evening, she had begun to worry. And then she realized that she didn't even know for sure which hospital he went to. And after only being in the US for 4 days, neither her nor Daniel had a phone, so she couldn't call to find out. And so by today, the following day, with still no word from her husband, Alejandra had panicked. Fortunately, though, Daniel had been clear-headed enough to give the interpreter the phone number at their extended family's apartment where his wife and his family were staying. And so when Alejandra had answered the phone that morning, a Spanish-speaking nurse from the hospital explained her husband's situation. Alejandra was horrified. She left the kids at the apartment and hurried to the hospital. Sitting beside Daniel's bed, Alejandra stroked his hand and prayed. She felt helpless and lost in this strange new place. A few minutes later, a nurse entered and introduced himself as the person Alejandra had spoken to on the phone. Behind him was an older man in a white coat, Daniel's doctor. The nurse told her there wasn't any time to waste. Daniel was dying, and the hospital could not figure out why. And so to help them, they needed more information about Daniel. Alejandra agreed to help them, but in her head, her husband's warning echoed. Daniel had coached her repeatedly before they'd come to Massachusetts from Mexico to never reveal personal information if asked by any authority figure. Saying the wrong thing could get them into serious trouble. But now, looking at Daniel, pale and lifeless on the bed, Alejandra could tell this was a different situation. The stakes were too high to hide something that might save the father of her kids. So, Alejandra caved and told them her family's story. Dr. Hunt sat there silently, listening closely to every word the translator spoke. Then he thanked Alejandra for sharing and promised he would not tell anyone else, and that thanks to her, he actually could save Daniel's life. A couple hours later, the results of Daniel's latest blood test came back, and Dr. Hunt finally knew what was making him sick. A deadly disease that is almost unheard of in the United States. The condition, called leptospirosis, is a bacterial disease responsible for nearly 60,000 deaths per year around the world. It's most commonly spread through the urine of infected animals like rats, cattle, dogs, and pigs. The disease-causing bacteria is particularly common in bodies of water after heavy rains, when runoff from farms flows into streams and rivers. And thanks to Alejandra's story, Dr. Hunt knew that Daniel had been in a particularly big river recently. Until last month, she and Daniel had lived their whole lives in central Mexico. But when Daniel lost his job there, they decided to take a chance and travel north in search of better opportunities. They had hiked, climbed, run, and paid strangers for rides across long distances. But when they finally reached the Mexico-Texas border, there was still one more wide, muddy obstacle standing between them and their new life in America, the Rio Grande River. To avoid being spotted, they had to cross at night. Alejandra and Daniel and their kids stuffed all their possessions into plastic bags, then hiked to a bend in the river where the water was slower, then waded in and swam as quickly and quietly as they could across. And that's when Daniel was very likely infected with the leptospirosis. Alejandra and the kids just happened to get lucky and dodged it. But Daniel was not so lucky, developing symptoms just days after his swim and coming to the brink of multi-organ failure in less than a week. But after 6 weeks of intensive antibiotics, Daniel was finally released from the hospital and made a full recovery. His journey to America had nearly killed him, but sharing the truth of his family's story ultimately saved his life. On the evening of Wednesday, September 24, 2003, 45-year-old Michael Alberto Jaquez laid down flat on his back on his yoga mat in front of a room full of his students at a yoga studio in downtown Tucson, Arizona. The students all followed Michael's lead, laying down for a pose called Shavasana, which signaled the end of a long workout. Michael loved this final pose because it was all about meditation, and it really helped him get centered for his day. And after a few minutes in this pose, when he sat up and told his students to rise as well, he felt both exhausted and recharged. He got to his feet and smiled at his class as everyone else rolled up their yoga mats and got ready to leave. Although Michael was a machinist by trade and spent his workdays in his shop tinkering with tools and small engines, he was actually a very artistic and kind of zen person. He spent his free time giving music lessons on his guitar, and he also taught 15 different yoga classes every week in various gyms and studios all across Tucson. His genuine enthusiasm about the physical, mental, and spiritual benefits of yoga were very infectious, and it put many of his students at ease around him. In fact, they were so comfortable with him that they called him MAD, which was short for his three initials, Michael Alberto Jaquez. Michael toweled the sweat off his face and looked up at the clock on the wall. It was almost 7 p.m., and his stomach was beginning to rumble. So he asked the class, as they were getting ready to go, if anybody was feeling up to grabbing some food and a few drinks, which was actually a question they were all expecting, because hanging out socially was something that this Wednesday group typically did each week after their workout. One student immediately shouted out that they would, and a few others raised their hands as well. So Michael suggested they all meet at a bar on 4th Avenue, not far from where the yoga studio was located. The students that were going all nodded their heads in agreement, and then all of them, the ones who were going and the ones who were not, all shuffled through the studio's door and outside to the parking lot. But before Michael shut off the studio lights and followed the group outside, he picked up his cell phone and called his girlfriend, Amber Trudell. He'd been seeing her off and on for about a year after first meeting her through his yoga lessons. Recently, things had been a bit rocky between Amber and Michael, but Michael still wanted to invite her out for dinner and drinks. He figured that by having her be a part of a big group setting out at a public place, that would sort of give them a chance to have fun without the opportunity to argue, since if they argued, it would be in front of everyone, so that was a natural deterrent. After a few rings, Amber answered her phone, and Michael told her very enthusiastically about his plans and said that he would love it if she came out with them. But Amber hesitated, and Michael frankly knew why. In addition to the problems they were having in their relationship, Amber was just a very shy person. She preferred private lessons with Michael rather than being a part of a big group where you had all these other people sort of watching you stretch for an hour. But after a few seconds of awkward silence on the line, Amber said that she actually would meet up with Michael and his students at the bar. Michael was thrilled and told Amber he would see her there. Then he ended the call, shut off the lights in the studio, and walked out the door into the parking lot, thinking about Amber. Michael and Amber were opposites, but that didn't really bother Michael. It also didn't bother him when Amber teased him about how he dressed like a hippie with his long hair and beaded necklace and sandals. Michael could take a joke, and above all, he liked to have fun, which in his mind was what he was doing with an attractive woman like Amber, who was actually 17 years younger than he was. Their relationship really was pretty casual, and Michael intended to keep it that way. He'd been married twice already and was a father to 3 kids as well as a grandfather. And at this point in his life, he did not want to be tied down anymore. Amber, on the other hand, she did want to get serious. She kept asking Michael to marry her, and every few weeks, she'd break up with him for saying no. And so Michael knew that their relationship status would likely come up tonight in conversation. But since there were other people going out with them, he figured maybe he could dodge an argument about it. A few minutes later, Michael walked into the bar on 4th Street and found 5 of his students already sitting at a table. He sat down and ordered a drink, and shortly after that, Michael looked up to see Amber walk in through the front door of the bar. He stood up from the table, gave her a big hug, and then invited her to take a spot right next to him. From that point on, the group ordered some food, and they drank and talked and goofed around until around 8:30 at night when folks started getting tired. At that point, they all paid their checks, and then they left. Now, most of the students were heading home at this point, but Michael, Amber, and one of the students, Michael's friend Eli, decided to continue their night and go have a few more drinks at another bar. So the 3 of them went to another establishment until around 10 p.m. And at that point, Eli decided it was time for him to call it a night. He took some cash from his wallet, put it down on the table, and then he headed home, leaving just Michael and Amber at the bar. And now that the couple was all alone, just as Michael expected, they began to fight. And so Michael began drinking faster and ordering more drinks for Amber, hoping that maybe more alcohol for both of them would mellow them out. 2 hours later, at midnight, when the bartender turned the lights off and then back on again and then announced out loud it was last call, both Michael and Amber were pretty drunk. Michael yawned, finished the rest of the drink in his glass, and asked Amber to come back to his house with him. She said she would, and so Michael and Amber paid their tab and then walked out the front door into the night. Shortly afterwards, the 2 of them stumbled up the walkway and onto the front porch of Michael's house at 2602 North Sparkman Boulevard. Michael unlocked the door, and then he and Amber stepped into the kitchen. A day and a half later, on Friday, September 26th, at around 6:30 in the morning, a woman was walking her dog along North Sparkman Boulevard in Tucson. The street was in a pretty rough neighborhood where there were lots of burglaries and muggings, and so most people kind of kept to themselves when they were passing through. Usually, the woman walked her dog at a fast pace with her head down, avoiding eye contact with other pedestrians and avoiding looking into other people's properties. However, when the woman passed in front of number 2602, something caught her attention. Just beyond some brush obscuring the front patio, she saw a flash of something light-colored that was obviously not vegetation. She turned her head to look and blinked for a second in confusion, because what she was looking at didn't make sense. It was a person's bare legs in shorts splayed out on the patio. Now, the weather had been excruciatingly hot and muggy and stifling for the last few days, including today, so the woman at first thought that maybe this person up on the porch had passed out from the heat. Now, as soon as she thought that, her first instinct was to walk up and investigate and make sure this person was okay. But since this was not really a safe neighborhood, the idea of just strolling up to some stranger's property seemed kind of risky. But just then, she saw another man walking on the street towards his car, and she called out to him and pointed over at the legs on the patio and asked if he would go see what was the matter. The man looked over at the house and saw what the woman was pointing at and sort of looked puzzled for a second. Then he turned back to the woman and gave a thumbs up, like, "Yep, I'll go check it out." Then the man walked over to the porch. The woman watched as the man walked up to the porch, and right as he got close to the legs, he called out the name Michael. And then the man who was doing this checkup, he began backing up, and then he turned and actually started running back towards the woman, and as he passed her, he just said, "I'm calling 911." Not long after that man called 911, Detective Ben Jimenez of the Tucson Police Department drove down North Sparkman Boulevard in his cruiser. He came to a stop just outside of number 2602, put his cruiser in park, and cut the engine. Around him, he saw other squad cars and ambulances doing the same thing. Jimenez stepped out of his air-conditioned cruiser into the hot, muggy morning air. He took off his suit jacket and tossed it onto the driver's seat, and then shut the door. He rolled up the sleeves of his white dress shirt, loosened his tie, and then walked from the curb up to the porch of the house, until he was standing next to the dead body of a man who was lying face up and wearing yoga pants and a tank top. Jimenez was not the first member of the Tucson PD on the scene, and one of the other officers who was already there told him that the body he was looking at belonged to the home's resident, who was named Michael Dojaquez. The officer told Jimenez that the rest of the property was empty. Michael was their only victim. Jimenez put on a pair of disposable gloves and squatted down next to the body. He could see there was a single bullet wound in the center of Michael's forehead. Around the bullet wound, Jimenez could see a black star-shaped gunpowder burn. There was lots of dried blood on the porch floor around the head, and more blood on Michael's clothes and legs. Jimenez mentioned to the officer to be on the lookout for any shell casings. Then Jimenez put his hand up to Michael's exposed skin and found that it was actually still warm. The fact the body had not gone cold yet suggested that Michael may have been killed only a few hours earlier, probably in the early hours of Friday morning. Jimenez looked at Michael's hands and saw that they were covered in scratches, which told him that Michael very likely must have fought with his attacker. Jimenez stood back up, but just as he was about to walk inside the house, he stopped, because he noticed that some guitar and violin cases were haphazardly stacked up outside on the porch. And this struck him as odd, because nobody in this neighborhood would ever store expensive musical equipment outside, or really anything sort of like obviously expensive outside, because it could get stolen. But regardless, Jimenez stepped through the front door and into the kitchen, and as he did, he saw more music gear. This time it was an amplifier and a guitar stand that had been left to the side of the door just inside the house. On the floor near the gear, Jimenez saw broken glass from a shattered window pane. And so already, Jimenez was beginning to develop a theory. He wondered if maybe Michael had interrupted a robbery. Maybe the thief or thieves had been in the process of shuffling the musical equipment out of the house onto the porch, kind of stacking it up near the door as they were doing it, when Michael came out and confronted them. The broken glass in the kitchen suggested that the fight maybe started there, or at least in part happened right there, and then from there, they moved through the door onto the porch where Michael was ultimately shot. And then when Jimenez did a walkthrough of the rest of the property, he found in Michael's workshop that it was perfectly intact and none of the very obviously expensive tools had been taken or moved. And so to Jimenez, this cemented his theory that very likely Michael had interrupted a robbery. And so very likely, at least according to Jimenez's theory, after the robber shot Michael, he figured that they must have panicked and then just taken off without finishing the job. By this point, the crime scene was swarming with members of the forensics unit and also uniformed officers. Jimenez knew it would take hours to process the scene for blood, fingerprints, and other trace evidence, and also officers were already out knocking on doors in the neighborhood looking for witnesses. So Jimenez decided to leave and go talk to detectives in the burglary division to see if they had any similar cases or usual suspects. Back inside of headquarters, Detective Jimenez walked quickly to the burglary division. He rapped on the open door of one of the offices there and caught the attention of a detective at a desk. Jimenez explained the case he just caught, laid out his theory about a home robbery gone wrong, and then asked the detective if he had any recent robberies on or around North Sparkman Boulevard. And the second Jimenez mentioned North Sparkman Boulevard, he saw this detective's eyes light up. He shot straight up in his chair and very excitedly said that yes, he did in fact have something. Just 5 days earlier, on Sunday, he had arrested 2 men, Joseph Keyes and David Wynn, for robbing a home in that exact same neighborhood. But that wasn't all. First of all, Keyes and Wynn lived in a house that was just a mile away from Michael's place, and, most importantly, one of the items these 2 men had stolen was a guitar. Jimenez knew this was a great starting point, so he got Keyes and Wynn's home address from the detective. Then Jimenez returned to his own desk and began filling out an application for a search warrant. While he waited for a judge to approve his request, Jimenez's phone rang. It was one of the officers who'd been knocking on doors over on North Sparkman Boulevard. The officer told Jimenez that nobody in the area heard any gunshots or any unusual noises coming from Michael's house early on Friday morning, and nobody seemed to have seen Michael at all for a day or two. However, one neighbor told police that on Thursday afternoon, Michael must have been working in his workshop because they'd heard his compressor going. So, the neighborhood canvass had not produced a witness to the killing, but they were starting to build a picture of Michael's final hours. Jimenez thanked the officer for the good work and hung up the phone, feeling satisfied. Less than 1 full day into his investigation, and he already had a very promising working theory, he had a search warrant application out to a judge, and he was refining, his victim's final moments to really get a sense of what actually happened here. But for now, it was late in the evening, and he knew he had a long day ahead of him tomorrow. So he shut down his computer and left his office. The next morning was Saturday, and Detective Jimenez arrived at his office to find that his search warrant application for the home of Joseph Keyes and David Wynn had been approved. He also found a copy of the autopsy report waiting for him, along with a couple of reports from other detectives who had begun to reach out to Michael's friends and family. Now, Jimenez was very eager to go search Wynn and Keyes' house, but first he picked up the autopsy report, flipped it open, and gave it a quick read. The coroner had found a .38 caliber bullet lodged in Michael's brain. The star-shaped gunpowder burn around the entry wound meant it had been fired at close range, which Jimenez had already guessed. And also the coroner noted that the wounds on Michael's hands were indeed very likely defensive wounds. The most useful part of the report focused on Michael's time of death. When Jimenez got to the scene and he touched Michael's body, it was warm to the touch, and so he had assumed that very likely Michael had died recently. Jimenez just didn't know exactly when. And the coroner was able to confirm that suspicion. Because Michael had not yet gone through rigor mortis, the coroner was able to establish an actual time of death. Michael had been shot somewhere between 2 and 3 a.m. on Friday morning. And so this information meant that Jimenez could be very specific when he was investigating suspect alibis. This was great news. Jimenez rifled through the other reports, which laid out a rough timeline of Michael's activities before his death. He had taught a yoga class on Wednesday night and gone out for drinks afterwards with some students and a girlfriend who Michael's friends knew only as Amber. Then on Thursday, he'd apparently spent the entire day holed up inside of his studio working. Jimenez put the reports down. He'd have to work on tracking down Amber later, but for now, that was not his priority. Instead, he gathered up a team of officers and drove over to the home of Joseph Keyes and David Wynn. When they got there, they knocked on the door, they didn't get an answer, and so eventually they forced their way inside, and immediately they discovered that there was nobody home. However, pretty quickly, once Jimenez walked into the kitchen, he knew coming to this house had put him on the right track, because in the kitchen, there was this very random-looking pile of clothes. Jimenez put on his gloves, squatted down, and one by one, he picked up a bandana, a pair of pants, and some shoes. And he saw that every item in this pile was splattered with blood. Jimenez was thinking that at this point, all he would need to do to close his case was get these items over to forensics and match the blood on these to the blood of his victim. But the next morning, when Jimenez walked into his office, he got two pieces of bad news, one right after the next. The first piece of bad news was that the forensics did not match. The blood found on the bandana, the pants, and the shoes was the wrong type. It didn't belong to Michael. And the second piece of bad news was that even though Joseph Keyes and David Wynn appeared to be the perfect suspects on paper for this murder, robbery detectives had found one big problem. When Michael was shot early on Friday morning, Keyes and Wynn were both already sitting inside of a jail cell. And so, just 2 days after Michael's body was found, Detective Jimenez found himself back at square one. Jimenez sat at his desk, flipping through reports from the crime scene, and hoping he'd stumble upon a detail that maybe he missed. And after about an hour of doing that, he did find something. On a list of items found inside of Michael's house, Jimenez saw a cell phone. At this time, in 2003, not everybody had a cell phone yet, so it wasn't something police immediately looked for when they arrived on a crime scene. Also, cell phones at this time did not contain the kind of evidence that they would today. There was no internet access on any of them, and people didn't send a whole bunch of text messages or really use them nearly as much as we do now. So Jimenez got up from his desk and walked to the evidence room to get the cell phone. And once he had it, he went straight to the single most useful piece of information the phone contained, and that was the call log. The detective began scrolling through the list of people Michael had spoken to before he died. And at the top of that list was the phone number for a contact listed as Amber Trudell. Jimenez read the name and immediately felt a jolt of excitement. Michael's friends had said that his girlfriend was named Amber. He had meant to track her down, and now he was staring down at, very likely, her phone number. Jimenez took the cell phone and went back to his desk. There, he used his own phone to dial Amber's phone number, but there was no answer. It just rang and finally went to voicemail, which was very disappointing. So Jimenez left a voicemail and asked Amber to please call him back at her earliest convenience. After he hung up, Jimenez just stared at the call history list again. And as he did, he noticed something curious. Michael had been killed on Friday morning, but his last call, which was to Amber, was made on Wednesday night. It seemed bizarre to Jimenez that there was this weird gap in time leading up to Michael's death. It was hard to imagine that all day Thursday, Michael hadn't spoken to anyone. And as he thought about this, he also found it to be kind of suspicious that Amber had not already come forward to talk to the police, considering that her boyfriend had been murdered. And so Jimenez began dialing numbers from Michael's contact list in his phone, including Michael's ex-wives and his adult kids, asking about Amber, looking for any information he could. But it seemed like no one really had any information about who this person was and what her role was in Michael's life. So, by the time Sunday came to a close, Jimenez had a new hunch about where he should focus his investigation: on his victim's girlfriend, Amber. The next morning, on Monday, when Amber still had not returned Jimenez's phone calls, he tried her again. And this time, his call went straight to voicemail instead of ringing like it had the day before. This meant her phone had shut off. Jimenez wasn't sure what to make of this. It was possible that Amber's cell phone had simply run out of batteries. In 2003, that wasn't that unusual to have your phone die and just sort of go without your phone for a while. Also, people did periodically just turn their phone off and not return calls. It was just a different time. But with every hour that went by that day without getting a call back from Amber, Jimenez couldn't help but get more suspicious. Finally, the next day on Tuesday, Jimenez got a phone call. When he picked it up, he hoped it was going to be Amber. But it wasn't Amber. It was Amber's boss, who Jimenez didn't know and had not called. And Amber's boss, who said she had heard about the murder on TV, had a story that changed everything Jimenez thought he knew about this case. The boss said that Amber worked for her as a bookkeeper at a charity called Child and Family Resources. And Amber was usually very reliable. But on Thursday, so a day before the murder, Amber had called out of work for what she said was a family emergency. She had been supposed to return a day ago, on Monday, but she hadn't shown up. And so Jimenez scribbled all this down, thinking that Amber did seem to make a pretty good suspect after all. But then, Amber's boss said there was one more thing. Amber's relationship with Michael was not a typical boyfriend-girlfriend relationship. It was an affair. Amber was married. Less than an hour later, Detective Jimenez walked into the air-conditioned bagel shop where Amber's boss had said that Amber's husband worked. After he had wrapped up the call with Amber's boss, Jimenez was left with a feeling of whiplash. Until her boss had told him about the husband, he had been viewing Amber as a possible suspect, and a good one. But now he was starting to wonder if maybe she was some kind of a victim. After all, right now she was still unaccounted for, nobody had heard from her, and this affair certainly gave her husband a very solid motive to potentially harm her, or harm Michael, or both. All Amber's boss had known about Amber's husband was his name, Justin Goodwin, and his place of employment, this bagel shop. However, when Jimenez asked the employee at the counter if Justin Goodwin was working, the employee looked surprised and kind of nervous, and just shook his head and said no. Then he told Jimenez to wait and left the counter to go into an office in the back. And then after a minute, another man walked out to the counter and introduced himself as the manager. And he told Jimenez that he was sorry, but Justin had worked here, but he quit his job very suddenly just the day before. To Jimenez, it was sort of head-spinning how quickly this new theory that Justin could be involved here was picking up steam. So he asked the manager if he knew anything about Justin's wife, Amber. And the manager made a sort of pained expression. He told Jimenez that all he knew was that their relationship seemed very tumultuous. In fact, Justin had once missed work because he'd been arrested for domestic violence. Jimenez could barely contain his eagerness as he asked the manager for Justin's address. Then, after he got it, he left the bagel shop and sped to the home of his new prime suspect. But when Jimenez arrived, the lights were off in the house. The driveway was empty, and nobody answered the door. And so Jimenez walked around to a few of the nearby houses and spoke to the neighbors, sweating in the heat the whole time, but they all said that they hadn't seen Amber or Justin for at least a few days. Disappointed, Jimenez gave them all his card and asked them to call him if they remembered anything or if they saw or heard anything out of the ordinary. For the next 3 days, Jimenez and his team searched for Amber and Justin and put out notifications to neighboring police departments to be on the lookout for them. But he didn't make any progress until Friday, October 3rd, exactly 1 week after the murder, when one of the neighbors whose doors he had knocked on called him back. It was a woman, and she sounded breathless and excited. She told Jimenez that he had to come back to Justin's house right now, because at this very moment, she was standing at her window and watching as Justin and another man were taking all the furniture out of Justin's home and loading it into a rental van. Jimenez immediately ran out of his office, hopped in his cruiser, and he sped over to Justin's house. And when he got there, he saw a man who he instantly recognized from the mugshots as Justin himself. And just like the neighbor had said, Justin clearly was taking furniture from his house and putting it into this van. Jimenez hopped out of his cruiser, quickly identified himself as a detective, and asked Justin what he was doing and where his wife was. Immediately, Justin looked nervous. He told Jimenez he was moving, which certainly wasn't illegal, and as for his wife, he said he had no idea. He said they were getting a divorce, and she was on her own. Then Justin did something that caught Jimenez totally by surprise. It was swelteringly hot outside, and at some point Justin lifted up his shirt to wipe the sweat off his face. And when he did, Jimenez saw tucked in Justin's waistband was a gun. Now, Jimenez had no idea if Justin had a license to carry this gun, but considering the entire circumstances, it was too much to overlook. And he told Justin he had to come down to the station and answer some questions. Once they were at the station, Jimenez led Justin into an interview room. At this point, the red flags around Justin were almost comically conspicuous. He had been arrested for domestic violence in the past, his wife was having an affair, and now she was missing, and her affair partner had been shot to death. Justin had quit his job and cleaned out the house where he and Amber lived, all while armed with a gun. So when Jimenez sat down at the table inside of this interview room, he felt pretty confident that he had his killer right in front of him. Jimenez handed Justin a bottle of water and then began asking him questions, starting with, did he know a man named Michael Dohaquez? Jimenez watched as Justin took the cap off his water and raised it to his mouth before answering, and he saw that Justin's hand was visibly shaking. After a second, Justin just said no, he didn't know anybody by that name. When Jimenez followed up and said that Michael and Amber were having an affair, Justin denied knowing that too. He said that he and Amber clearly were having problems, they were getting a divorce, but those problems had nothing to do with anybody named Michael. He swore again that he really had no idea where Amber was, and insisted that all of the incriminating facts that seemed to surround him were just a coincidence. Right as Jimenez was starting to get frustrated with Justin, feeling like he was blatantly lying to him, there was a knock on the interview room door. Jimenez turned around to see another officer step inside, holding up Justin's cell phone, which they had confiscated along with Justin's gun when they questioned him. The officer apologized for interrupting, but asked Jimenez if he could please step out of the room and speak to him for a moment. Jimenez got up and left the interview room, and the officer handed him Justin's cell phone. He explained that the whole time Jimenez had been questioning Justin, it had been ringing incessantly, and finally he had just picked it up. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman, and she had hung up as soon as he, the officer, had identified himself as police. However, the officer had traced the phone number and found that it belonged to the Extended Stay America Hotel right there in Tucson. Jimenez could not believe his luck. Whoever that was calling Justin, if he could just catch them before they left that hotel, they might be able to give him some real answers about what Justin had been up to for the past few days. So Jimenez asked the officer to keep an eye on Justin because he was going to go track down this mystery caller. A half an hour later, Jimenez was offering a pleasant but very impatient smile to the employee behind the front desk at the Extended Stay America Hotel. The detective had no way of knowing what room the mystery calls had come from, so the employee was looking it up for him, but it was taking forever. Finally, though, the employee looked up and said he did have a woman staying in the room where the calls came from, and the employee said that woman's name was Amber Trudell. Detective Jimenez would take Amber back to the police station and would spend the next several hours untangling her story and Justin's. The detective's murder case was changing faster than he could even keep up with. First, it had looked like a robbery, and he'd had 2 slam-dunk suspects, but that had fallen apart in days. Then he had Amber Trudell, the suspicious girlfriend, who he thought maybe was dodging his calls because she was guilty, but Amber had turned out to be missing, and a possible victim. That revelation had given him Justin Goodwin, the jealous husband, but just as Jimenez had thought he was closing in on Justin for killing Michael and maybe even Amber too, Amber herself had reappeared, holed up in a hotel, and calling Justin over and over again. Whatever Justin and Amber were relationship-wise, they apparently were not totally broken up yet. And so now Jimenez was considering yet another theory, that maybe Justin and Amber had killed Michael together. He figured he could put them both in separate interview rooms, take each of their statements, and then grill them on the inconsistencies that he was absolutely certain he was going to find. But that didn't happen. To Jimenez's shock, Justin and Amber's stories matched each other perfectly. Yes, they said they were having marital problems, and yes, they saw how suspicious all their behavior looked. Between Justin quitting his job and lying to police about where Amber was, and Amber abandoning her job and ignoring all of Jimenez's calls while hiding in a hotel, but they swore they didn't kill Michael, and they had alibis to prove it. Because on Thursday morning, so almost a full 24 hours before the murder, they had left Tucson, headed 3.5 hours north to a mountain town called Sholo, Arizona, where Justin's mother and stepfather lived. They told Jimenez to call Justin's parents and check for himself. And so Jimenez did just that, not really sure what to expect. He didn't really have high hopes here that they were going to actually be able to confirm their alibi. But it would turn out that Justin's stepfather, he was a retired police detective, and he was very straightforward and specific about the timeline. And even though this kind of poked a hole in his whole case, Jimenez believed him. And so this meant that between the hours of 2 and 3 a.m. on Friday, when Michael was shot to death, Amber and Justin were almost 200 miles away. And not only that, but Justin's gun, that had been such a red flag, was not the same caliber as the murder weapon. And so Jimenez's best suspects were just more dead ends. Jimenez let Amber and Justin leave the police station, and he went back to his desk, where he slumped in his chair and stared miserably at nothing. By now, it was late in the day, and Jimenez had no new ideas. His case was turning out to be much more complicated than he had initially thought, and now nothing was making any sense. And so he figured, what he really needed to do now was just take the weekend and look at the case with fresh eyes on Monday. There had to be something he was missing, some piece of evidence that he was either misinterpreting or missing altogether. He decided he would make one more phone call and then head home. He picked up the phone on his desk and dialed the number for the coroner's office. And like he expected, on a Friday night, nobody picked up. So he left a voicemail asking the coroner to take one more look at all the Michael Dohakwa's evidence. He explained he wasn't totally sure what he was looking for, but something just didn't feel right, and he wanted the coroner to look really closely one more time so that he had sort of a good starting point on Monday. Then Jimenez hung up the phone, picked up his jacket, and headed home. The tip that would break this case wide open came early the following week, but the tip didn't come from the coroner. It was a phone call from someone Detective Jimenez had spoken to already in this investigation, and who he never expected to hear from again. This person said that Jimenez had to come meet with them right now, and Jimenez didn't hesitate, because what this person had to say didn't make sense with the rest of the evidence that the detective had. But the detective no longer trusted all of his evidence. He was sure there was something wrong with his facts, he just wasn't sure what it was, and so maybe this was part of it. Jimenez drove out to meet the person who called him, and the person took him for a walk. They said they wanted to show him a hole that they had found in the dirt. And when Jimenez got to that hole, he stood there panting in the warm air, and he realized that finally, he knew who his murderer was. He just had to figure out how this was possible. And this is where the coroner came in. Because shortly after Jimenez got back to the station, the coroner called to tell Jimenez that he had been right. They had all misinterpreted one very important piece of evidence. The truth had been right in front of them all along. They just hadn't put it together. Based on evidence collected over the course of a few weeks and the revised results of the autopsy, this is what police believe happened to Michael Dohakwa on the morning that he was killed. It was 1:30 in the morning, and Michael had just confronted his killer in the messy kitchen of his home. The killer was enraged, and the two of them were standing near the sink, shouting at each other. At some point, the killer grabbed a glass and threw it at Michael, but Michael managed to dodge it, and the glass hit a window pane near the front door, shattering glass all over the ground. Michael was about to step towards the killer to stop them from throwing anything else at him, but there was something he didn't realize. The killer was hiding a revolver. And suddenly the killer drew their weapon, and when Michael saw it, he rushed forward to try to wrench it out of their hands. They struggled, but Michael couldn't get a hold of the gun, and they wrestled together out the front door, and then the killer fired. Michael fell backwards onto the patio, dead. At this point, the killer looked up and down North Sparkman Boulevard to make sure nobody was around, and when they were sure they were good, they took off running into the warm summer night. It would turn out all of Jimenez's suspects, Joseph Keyes, David Wynn, Justin Goodwin, and Amber Trudell, did have alibis for Friday, September 26th, between 2 and 3 a.m., which was when the police thought Michael had been murdered. But law enforcement was wrong about Michael's time of death. The heat had fooled them. Michael was not shot to death early on Friday morning, September 26th. He was shot to death early on Thursday morning, September 25th. His body was warm when Detective Jimenez reached down to touch his skin because it had been very hot and muggy outside the whole time he was lying there. The coroner thought the body temperature, combined with the flexibility of the body, meant that death had been recent and that rigor mortis had not begun. But in reality, a hot and moist environment can cause rigor mortis to happen more quickly after death and last for a shorter period of time. So in reality, Michael's rigor mortis had already come and gone by the time Jimenez touched his body. And so the reason he was sort of flaccid feeling is because he no longer was in rigor mortis. And so when the coroner had gone back over the evidence at Detective Jimenez's request, he found something he had missed. Michael's body had larvae in its eyes, which was an indication that he had been dead for a lot longer than a few hours. And when police went back to the crime scene, they realized that the compressor the neighbor had heard on Thursday, which caused them to think that Michael was alive and well and working in a shop that day, was actually set to refill automatically. So that noise had not meant anything at all. It did not mean that Michael was in there at work. And so the adjustment of the time of death from Friday to Thursday morning allowed Jimenez to make sense of that final phone call he got from the person he had already spoken to, who called him asking to meet. That person was Justin's stepfather, the retired police officer. The stepfather had been telling the truth about the timing of Justin and Amber's visit, and that had ruled them out as suspects when the belief was Michael had been killed on Friday. But after he had gotten off the phone with Jimenez, the stepfather had followed a hunch out to the back of his property where he discovered a hole in the dirt. And inside that hole was the murder weapon. But the person who hid that gun was not Justin. It was his soon-to-be ex-wife, Amber Trudell. On Friday, October 10th, an arrest warrant and a nationwide alert was issued for Amber, who had fled Tucson. U.S. Marshals arrested Amber at her grandmother's house in New York. During her trial in March of 2005, Amber claimed that Michael sexually assaulted her on the night he was killed, and that he himself was actually the one who pulled the trigger during their struggle, which resulted in him being shot and killed. However, she was still convicted of second-degree murder and was sentenced to 13 years in prison. On October 19, 2016, Amber was released from prison, having served out her entire sentence. In the late summer of 1930, Rafael Pansardi and his wife Leonarda Cianciulli moved with their 4 young kids to a little town in northern Italy called Correggio. A terrible earthquake had destroyed the family's previous village and killed nearly all of their neighbors. And so this family was feeling very lucky to be alive, but when they arrived in Correggio, they really had nothing and were hoping that, the people of this town will just be very welcoming and generous and kind of help them get set up again. And the people of this town did exactly that. Correggio was this beautiful place inside of a fertile valley where people lived in these cottages surrounded by rice fields and mulberry trees. And the people who lived there were very tight-knit and looked after each other and cooked for each other and had parties together. I mean, this was a real community. And so when Rafael and Leonarda arrived, the townspeople immediately found them this cute little cottage by a stream with a whitewashed front door and a beautiful stone hearth for cooking. And there was an attached storefront on this cottage that they were giving them. And then on top of that, once the family had moved in, the family's new neighbors helped get Rafael a job, and they also helped Leonarda set up the attached storefront that was part of their cottage so she could sell her homemade soap bars out of this shop. And so very quickly, the family just completely fell in love with Correggio, especially 36-year-old Leonarda. Losing her home and her previous neighbors in that terrible earthquake had been a tragedy on epic scale, but it was far from the first tragedy that Leonarda had been forced to live through. Leonarda had been born into poverty. Her mother had actually come from a very wealthy family, but they had cut Leonarda's mom off when she became pregnant with Leonarda. And so when Leonarda's mom gave birth to her, she blamed Leonarda for their poverty and all of their problems, and so beat her relentlessly. And then on top of that, Leonarda's father died when she was very young, and so she was stuck at home being abused constantly by her mother. When Leonarda was 21, she met Rafael and fell in love with him, and he was a very kind and gentle man. He really made a very strong first impression on anyone who met him. But when Leonarda went to her mother and introduced Rafael to her and said, "I'm going to marry this man, I love him," her mother flew into a rage and then literally cursed Leonarda. She actually out loud muttered the spell and then told Leonarda that because of the spell, Leonarda would have evil following her forever. Now, of course, Leonarda was very used to her mother's terrible behavior, and so she did not actually think she was at risk of this curse affecting her life in any way. But not long after actually marrying Rafael, Leonarda began to see evidence that this curse might actually be real. It started with Leonarda having these sudden fits of seizures for no particular reason, and then Leonarda, every time she got pregnant, she would miscarry and lose the baby. And so feeling really sad and desperate because all she wanted was a family, Leonarda actually went to a fortune teller in hopes that they would tell her that in the future, her life got better, not worse, which to Leonarda meant, the curse was not real if my life improves. But after this fortune teller took Leonarda's hands and studied her palms, she looked up at Leonarda and gave her grave news. She said, "Leonarda, you're going to have living children, but they're all going to die young. and I see a prison and an insane asylum in your future. This experience totally shocked Leonarda and confirmed for her that her mother's curse must be real. And sure enough, over the following years, Leonarda and Raphael would go on to have 14 living children, and 10 of them would die when they were babies or toddlers. And so by the time Leonarda had arrived in Correggio with her family in 1930, she was absolutely petrified that her last 4 precious children would die because of this curse. And so in order to keep her kids safe, she basically never let them out of her sight, and then she also made sure they always adhered to these strange rules and beliefs that Leonarda had come up with about good and evil that were designed to somehow protect the kids from this curse. But the incredible show of generosity and support and kindness that Leonarda and her family had experienced when they arrived in Correggio had really done something to Leonarda. In fact, it really kind of changed the way she viewed the world. Suddenly, she was less concerned with this curse and how to protect her family from it, and instead, she was just kind of content. She felt safe. She felt happy. The women in the town loved Leonarda and always came by the house to say hi to her and eat some of the amazing tea cakes that she would make. And also Leonarda had become best friends with this woman named Virginia, who was a former opera singer from Milan, who was very elegant and beautiful. And every time she went to a dinner party, she would invite Leonarda. And also Leonarda and her family were becoming financially stable really for the first time ever. Leonarda's soap shop that she ran out of their cottage was really successful. People came from all around to buy her soaps because nobody could make them like she could. And Raphael's job as a clerk was very steady, and he too was becoming well respected in town. And so because of how well this transition to Correggio had been, at some point Leonarda made a promise both to herself and to the universe that instead of focusing all of her time and energy on this curse, which had plagued her whole life, instead she was going to focus on helping the people of Correggio any way she could, because they had done so much for her. And that is exactly what Leonarda did, but in a kind of ironic way. Because of the fear Leonarda had for her mother's curse, she had gone to that fortune teller many years ago. And even though the news she got when she saw the fortune teller was horrible, Leonarda had left that experience kind of fascinated with the art of fortune telling and magic and sorcery. It just really appealed to her. And so now that Leonarda was running this very successful soap shop out of her house, there were all these people coming from far and wide that would ask to barter for her soaps. Bartering is like trading one item for another item versus paying for something outright with money. And so Leonarda began bartering with these travelers whenever they had books about fortune telling, about magic, about sorcery, about how to make potions, about the occult. And after reading through all of these books and learning as much as she could, Leonarda, in addition to selling her soaps, began offering fortune telling services to the people of Correggio. And it would turn out she was really good at predicting the future, to the point where people in town basically began going to her for all kinds of advice. She helped women find love, she told farmers what crops to plant, she created these charm bags for people and told them they would protect them. She also began creating these herb potions for people when they got sick. It actually got to the point where people trusted her so much that when they got sick, they didn't even go to the doctor. They just went to her. And so very quickly, Leonarda felt very proud of the fact that she had lived up to the promise she had made both to herself and to the universe to always help the people of Correggio at every turn. But more than that, Leonarda was starting to think that this newfound sense of purpose and happiness she was getting in helping the people of Correggio through her various services had finally broken her mother's curse. By 1939, Leonarda and her family had been living in Correggio very happily for almost 10 years, and at the time, Leonarda's oldest son, Giuseppe, was 17 years old. Giuseppe was tall, he was handsome, he had dark hair, he had dark eyes, and all the girls loved him. And Giuseppe and Leonarda had always had a very close relationship. Every day, Giuseppe would come home, and he and his mom would sit in the kitchen, and they would chat for a while and eat some of her tea cakes. But now, in 1939, when Giuseppe was 17, he started to act a little bit different. He would come home, and instead of going into the kitchen to sit with Leonarda, he would just go straight to his room and shut the door. And when Leonarda or Raphael would ask him, hey, is everything okay? Giuseppe would get very defensive and say he was fine and to please just leave me alone. But to Leonarda, it seemed really obvious that her son was not fine, and she thought, maybe he has some sort of secret he's keeping, and that's what's making him act this way. He's hurting on the inside, but he can't share it with the world. But Leonarda had no idea what this secret might be. And then one day, late that same year, Leonarda was walking through town when one of her neighbors came up to her and said, "Hey, are you aware that your son, Giuseppe, has signed up for the military and he's leaving for training in just a few months?" Leonarda had not heard about this. People were talking a lot about World War II, which had just started around this time, but Leonarda had never considered that her precious son would go off to fight in that war. But now, Leonarda realized that Giuseppe's recent strange behavior suddenly made sense. This was the secret he was keeping. He had joined the military, and he hadn't told his family. Leonarda turned around and went straight home. She went right into her bedroom, shut the door, and she just sobbed. To her, it felt like her mother's curse was back, and now her precious son was going to go off into the war and he was going to die, unless she found a way to combat this evil that was now following her again. For the next several days, Leonarda did not open up her soap shop, she didn't come downstairs, she just stayed locked in her bedroom and read through all of her books about magic and sorcery and the occult, looking for some sort of solution for how to fight this curse. And finally, she figured out what she had to do. She read that if she gave something beautiful to the universe would reward her. And in Leonarda's mind, that reward would be sparing her son. And so Leonarda decided that the most beautiful thing she could offer the universe would be to help the people of Correggio, which she was already doing, but in her mind, she thought she could really ramp up her efforts and really try to change people's lives. And she thought if she could do that, the universe was sure to notice and it would save her son's life. Leonarda decided that the first person she would really go above and beyond to help inside of Correggio was a woman named Faustina. Faustina, who was in her 70s, was desperate to get married, but to many people in town, including Leonarda, she seemed kind of beyond help. She was totally antisocial, she was awkward, and just kind of given her age, it seemed like marriage was just not in the cards for her. But this is where Leonarda thought she could step in and change everything for Faustina. She would find her a husband. So Leonarda reached out to Faustina and told her about a friend of hers, a man who lived in a city to the north, who was also alone in his old age and who was likely looking for marriage, and she could set them up if Faustina was interested. And so Faustina was immediately interested and wanted to meet this guy, but Leonarda did tell her that, this guy, the reason he's not married is he's kind of difficult to be around. He's kind of a jerk, but he's got a wonderful heart. He means well. I think he'd be a great fit for you. And so again, Faustina's like, great, I want to meet him. I want to marry him. I'm ready. And then finally, the day came when Faustina actually went to this other town and met this guy in person, and they fell in love. And Faustina just moved right in with him. And before long, she was sending happy postcards back to Correggio, telling everyone about how happy she was and how thankful she was for Leonarda's help in setting them up. And so Leonarda was obviously thrilled, not only for her friend's happiness, but also it really felt like she had checked the box in terms of really going above and beyond to help someone in Correggio in an effort to get the universe to spare her son. But her son was still a couple months away from leaving for training, and Leonarda, she's very superstitious, and she's thinking, okay, I don't know if that was enough to get the universe to save my son, and so I need to find somebody else I can help. So, in September of 1940, Leonarda began her next good deed project with another woman in town. She was a widow in her 50s named Francesca. She had worked as a teacher, But when her husband got sick, she quit her job, and then when her husband ultimately died, she was left with nothing. So Leonarda reached out to Francesca and told her that she, Leonarda, would be willing to reach out to her own mother's rich family to see if maybe they had a job they could finesse for Francesca. Now, of course, Leonarda was not excited about talking to her mother's family, who had disowned her mother and had shown no interest in Leonarda, but Leonarda wanted to do this for Francesca and for the sake of her son and getting the universe to notice what she was doing. And so sure enough, Leonarda would reach out to her mother's family, and they were remarkably open to the idea, and they got a job for Francesca in Switzerland. And so eventually, Francesca jetted off to Switzerland, and then a couple of days later, she was sending postcards back to Correggio saying how happy she was and how thankful she was for Leonarda's help. And so again, Leonarda was so happy about this outcome, both because she cared about Francesca and also because this was yet another kind of check in the box of her good deeds that the universe was going to notice that in turn would save her son. But again, after Francesca didn't need any more help, Leonarda found herself looking at her son, who was getting closer and closer to leaving for training, and she would think to herself, have I done enough to protect him? Have I really stopped this curse from killing him after he leaves? And Leonarda eventually decided that no, she had not done enough. She needed to do at least one more really big good deed for someone in this town. And who better to help than her best friend, Virginia, the former opera singer. Leonarda knew from all her talks with Virginia that Virginia really missed living in the big city and going to the opera house. And so Leonarda reached out to Virginia and said, you know what, I can reach out to my mother's rich family and maybe they can find a job for you in a big city if you're interested. And so Virginia was like, wow, yes, I would love that. That's an amazing opportunity. And so Leonarda again would contact her mother's rich family, and again they came through, finding this job as a social planner for this very rich guy in Florence, Italy, who often funded plays and operas. And so this job was perfect for Virginia. When Leonarda told Virginia about this opportunity, Virginia cried tears of joy. After packing up all of her things, Virginia made a stop at Leonarda's house to say goodbye and thank you, and the two women would hug and laugh and cry, they would drink wine together, and then finally, when it was time for Virginia to go, even though Leonarda was very sad, she was also quite happy, because finally she felt like this good deed was enough to get the universe to spare her son. However, Leonarda, being a very superstitious person, did have one more little thing she wanted to do with Giuseppe before he left for the military. And this little thing was her, Leonarda, bathing her son, her 18-year-old son, with a particular bar of soap, and then she also wanted to feed him a special kind of tea cake that she was going to make. The soap and the tea cake had these special herbs and ingredients and different things she had pulled from her books of magic and the occult, and they would kind of form like a protective barrier both outside and inside of Giuseppe. So, on the same night that Virginia headed off to Florence, when Giuseppe came home, Leonarda approached him and said, I want to give you this bath and I want to feed you these tea cakes. And Giuseppe was not remotely enthused at the idea of having his mom bathe him. He's 18. But he knew she was highly superstitious, she seemed pretty emotional about this, and it just seemed like it was extremely important to her, and so he said, okay. And so Leonarda washed her son with this special kind of magic soap, and then she also gave him the tea cakes, and then afterward, even though Giuseppe was really annoyed by what he had just been asked to do, Leonarda was so happy she was practically floating. She felt like she had done everything she could possibly do, and now she could just relax because her son was safe. But soon, Leonarda would learn that that was not actually true. A few days after giving her son the magical last bath and magical tea cakes, the police showed up at the front door of Leonarda's house. And when she opened the door and saw the police, she asked what was going on, and the police would say to her, hey, the 3 women that you supposedly helped that left town recently, they've all been reported missing by their families. They don't know where they are. And so Leonarda, she was totally shocked by this, and
she said, no, that's not possible. I write to them all the time. I get postcards that come in very regularly from all of them. And then Leonardo went and got the postcards and showed the police, like, look, I'm talking to them. How could they possibly be missing? And so the police, they would look at these letters and they would agree with Leonardo that it is pretty strange that she'd be getting these very authentic seeming letters from these women if these women were also missing. And so eventually the police would leave and they would tell Leonardo that they would be in touch if they needed anything. And then over the next couple of days, Leonardo was very concerned about these three women, but she received numerous postcards from these women over those several days, and all of these postcards were totally normal seeming. And so Leonardo was fairly confident that whatever was going on with the police had to have been a mix-up, and she wouldn't be hearing from them again. But a couple of weeks later, the police did come back to Leonardo's house, except this time they didn't knock, they just barged right in. After the police had spoken with Leonardo that first time, they did some digging on these letters that she was receiving, and they managed to trace them all back to their start point. And it turned out all of these letters from all three of these women were originating from one place. It was this little town to the north of Correggio. And when police went to this little town, they discovered that these letters that were starting in this little town were all being mailed by the same person. And they got a physical description of this person who apparently was pretending to be these three women. And the description was of a tall, handsome young man with dark hair and dark eyes. It was Giuseppe. After the police barged into Leonardo's house, they went straight to Giuseppe's room where they accused him of murdering those three women, and then they hauled him out of the house and brought him to the station to question him about where he dumped the bodies. When the last police officer left Leonardo's house, Leonardo walked outside and just stood there wondering what she was going to do. It was like she had done everything in her power to protect her son from this curse, but somehow this curse she knew had done this to her son. And so now she knew there was only one thing she could do. Without saying anything to her husband, she went inside, she got her things, and she began making her way to the police station. At this point in her life, Leonardo looked much older than her actual age of 46. She had very gray hair, her face was very wrinkled, and she was stooped over, and she was always carrying these charm bags and magical potions and little stick figures that she claimed protected her family. And so her overall appearance when she wandered into the police station was that of a very frail old woman who was also very strange. And so Leonardo hobbled her way up to the front desk, and in a trembling voice, she asked the attendant if she could speak to the detective who was working on her son's case. And then a moment later, she was led into an interview room where she was told to wait. And then a little while later, the lead detective walked into the room. He sat down across the table from Leonardo and he said, "What can I do for you?" And immediately Leonardo said, "My son, Giuseppe, is innocent." And the detective, when he heard this, he was not remotely surprised. In fact, this is fully what he expected this conversation was going to be. He knew Leonardo loved her son very much, and of course she was going to say he was innocent. This is what parents typically did in cases like this. But the detective decided he wouldn't try to stop her. He would just let this very distraught mother kind of talk for a bit. He would tell her that he would follow up on whatever she was saying, and then he would drive her back home. But this detective was not expecting the things that would come out of Leonardo's mouth over the next couple of hours. In fact, her story about why Giuseppe was innocent was so shocking and so bizarre that the detective outright said, "I don't believe you. I don't believe this. This can't be true." And then other officers were called in to listen to her story to see if they believed it. And they too said, "This doesn't seem real." But the police would follow up on the details she gave, and it all checked out. It would turn out back in late 1939, on the day that Faustina, the first woman that Leonardo pledged to help in order to get the universe to save her son, when Faustina was set to go north and meet her future husband, Faustina stopped by Leonardo's house to say bye. And when she was in Leonardo's house, something very unexpected happened. When Faustina walked into Leonardo's kitchen where Leonardo was, Faustina was so excited about meeting her potential future husband that her hands were shaking and she was smiling ear to ear. And so Leonardo said to Faustina, "Hey, you need to calm down." And so she handed Faustina a glass of wine. And so Faustina took the wine and she had a couple of sips of wine, and right away Faustina started feeling dizzy, and before long she was grabbing the table just to keep from falling over. It would turn out the wine was poisoned by Leonarda, and so Faustina, she's kind of looking up at Leonarda, and Leonarda is looking down at her, and she's got an axe in one of her hands. And she says to Faustina, "I'm so sorry." And then she winds up and she strikes Faustina in the chest with the axe and lodges it in her chest. And so she lets go of it, expecting Faustina to die. She doesn't. Faustina's just standing there with an axe in her chest. And so Leonarda grabbed the handle of the axe, she pulled it out of her chest, and then began wailing on her head over and over and over again until Faustina did fall to the ground dead. Then Leonarda lit a fire under her big metal pot on the stove, and then she cut Faustina's body into 9 pieces. She drained the blood out of the body into a bucket, and then she chucked those 9 pieces into the pot on the stove and began to mix them with caustic soda, which is a powerful dissolving agent that's used to make soap. And then she boiled the ingredients, her body parts and this caustic soda, for hours. Faustina's body slowly turned into this horrible black mush inside of this pot, and Leonarda was watching this the whole time, and she just had a look of total disappointment as this was happening. And then at some point she just took the pot off the stove and dumped the ingredients, Faustina's body, down the septic tank, and then Leonarda waited for Faustina's blood that she had dumped out to coagulate, which means it became semi-solid, and then she heated it up in the oven and then ground it into flour. And she would use that flour to make tea cakes, which she fed to her friends the next day, as well as her son, Giuseppe. Leonarda also asked her son to mail some letters for her from the little town to the north where Faustina had supposedly gone. These letters, of course, were written by Leonarda, pretending to be Faustina to give the impression that she was still alive and well. And Giuseppe, when he was told to go mail these letters, didn't think anything of it. He was used to doing errands for his mom. Even though Leonarda basically got away with killing Faustina, her plan for Faustina had not really gone the way Leonarda had hoped. When she boiled Faustina's chopped up body parts and this caustic soda, they didn't really mix the way she wanted them to. Leonarda was convinced that the reason for this is because Faustina was too skinny, and so there wasn't enough fat on her body for the mix to be perfect. So Leonarda had come up with another elaborate story, this time for another woman, Francesca, about that job in Switzerland she got through her mother's rich family. Of course, none of that was true, and when Francesca came by Leonarda's house to say goodbye to her, she was offered a glass of poisoned wine, and after she sipped from it, she became dizzy, and then Leonarda showed up with an axe and hacked Francesca to death. But again, when the body parts and the caustic soda were in the pot on the stove boiling together, they were still not coming together the way Leonarda wanted. And so again, Leonarda, with a look of disgust, just dumped the pot down the septic tank and wound up making tea cakes from Francesca's blood. Then the next day, she fed those tea cakes to her friends, as well as Giuseppe, and she also asked Giuseppe to send a few more letters from up north. These letters were, of course, from Francesca. Still feeling totally unsatisfied with how the last 2 killings had gone, Leonarda moved on to her third target, her best friend, Virginia. And this time, when Virginia came by Leonarda's house to say goodbye, everything went to plan. Leonarda was able to poison Virginia, she killed her with the axe, she chopped her up, she put her in the pot, and this time, the 9 chunks of her body mixed beautifully with the caustic soda. And so after adding a few fine perfumes into the pot, Leonarda was finally able to create the thing that she had not been able to create with the other 2 women's bodies. And that was a beautiful, rich, creamy bar of soap. She also, again, made tea cakes from Virginia's blood. That night, when Giuseppe came home, Leonarda demanded that she be allowed to bathe him with her magic soap, i.e. the soap made from Virginia's body. And so she did that. She scrubbed him with Virginia's body soap. And then while she was doing that, she fed him the tea cakes that were made from Virginia's blood. It would turn out Leonarda did in fact believe that in order to save her son from this curse, she would need to give something beautiful to the universe. And at first, she really had believed that the way to do that was by helping the people of Correggio above and beyond anything she had ever done before. But at some point during her interactions with Faustina, the first woman, Leonarda had decided that, you know what, that wasn't enough. She really needed to make sure that her son was going to be safe. And so the only way really that Leonarda could guarantee her son would be safe would be if she actually took a life and gave that back to the universe. That would save her son. The reason Leonarda wound up taking 3 lives and not just 1 life is because she also decided that as an extra protective measure, she wanted to make sure that she actually bathed her son, literally, in the body parts and kind of essence of the life she had taken. And so that's where the idea of the soap came in. However, the first 2 women, their body parts didn't mix right, and so she couldn't turn them into soap. But then Virginia came along, and her body did mix with the caustic soda, and so Leonarda was able to make her soap. She was able to bathe her son with Virginia's body and feed him Virginia's blood. And so in Leonarda's mind, she had done everything she could to protect her son at that point. Leonarda would ultimately be sentenced to 30 years in prison, as well as 3 years in an insane asylum, just as the fortune teller had predicted. Leonarda died in 1970 when she was 76 years old. As for her family, they fled Correggio, and 3 of her children changed their names and vanished. And her prized son, Giuseppe, who she had killed to protect, had gone on to join the military, and he would go to war, and he either was killed in combat or simply changed his name and vanished as well. On Wednesday, April 26, 2006, a bright, beautiful, outgoing 18-year-old named Whitney Sarek began making her way across her campus towards her lecture hall where she had a class that morning. Whitney was a freshman at Taylor University, which is an evangelical Christian liberal arts college located in Upland, Indiana. Upland is a little town that sits about 2 miles east of Interstate 69 and is situated right between the 2 much larger cities of Indianapolis and Fort Wayne. As Whitney made her way along the pathway across campus and she passed by other throngs of students hustling to their own classes, she suddenly had a pang of anxiety as she realized the end of the school year was fast approaching. And while Whitney was definitely excited to head back home to rural Gaylord, Michigan, where she was from, to spend her summer vacation, she was also kind of bummed because she would have to say bye to all of her new friends in college that she wouldn't see again until after summer break in the fall when the next school year started. Whitney had made a ton of friends over the course of her freshman year, and by and large they were other freshmen like herself. But she did have a few friends that were upperclassmen, because early in Whitney's collegiate career, she had discovered that upperclassmen were just as friendly as freshmen, and they came with the bonus of lots of experience and expertise, and if you just asked them for guidance or advice, they'd be happy to give it to you. And so over the course of the school year, anytime Whitney had an opportunity to interact with or be around upperclassmen, she would take it, thinking, maybe I can learn something. And in fact, that morning, as Whitney was making her way across campus, she saw a sign that was asking for students to volunteer to the next day head out to this banquet hall to set up this big banquet for the school's new incoming president. And so when Whitney walked over to the table and asked the people what this was all about, she would learn that the majority of the people that had signed up to be volunteers so far were upperclassmen. And so as soon as she heard that, Whitney was quick to write her name down as well. The rest of the day would go completely as normal for Whitney. She would go to her classes, she would study, she would meet up with friends, and then eventually in the evening, she would make her way back to her dorm room where she would go to sleep. Little did she know, when she put her head down on the pillow that night, she was within 24 hours of her life changing in the most drastic way imaginable. The following morning, Whitney got up early, she took a shower, she brushed her teeth, and then she spent quite a while just staring at her wardrobe, debating which outfit she was going to wear, and then finally she chose the one she wanted and she got dressed. Whitney was not vain, but she knew the whole day would be spent around upperclassmen and university staff, and so she wanted to look her best. On her way towards her door to leave, Whitney would stop and look in her mirror one last time to make sure she looked okay, and in this fleeting moment, as she's looking herself up and down, she couldn't help but feel a justifiable sense of pride in this woman looking back at her. She had gotten into a great college, she had moved hundreds of miles from home and lived alone by herself for the first time, and her grades all year had been excellent. And so as Whitney's looking at herself, she thought to herself, you know what? I'm doing pretty good. Whitney's gaze would move from her reflection up to the clock on the wall, and she would see she was running late. And so she quickly grabbed her jacket, she threw it over her shoulder, and she went out the door. When Whitney arrived at the meeting spot in the parking lot nearby, she saw there was a group of what looked like students standing around a university van. And so Whitney walked up to them, and sure enough, this was the group of volunteers. It consisted of 7 other Taylor students, most of which were seniors, and 1 university staff member. And so Whitney didn't know any of them, and so she quickly introduced herself, everyone said hi, and then because Whitney was the last person they were waiting on, very quickly after she arrived, they were kind of ushered into the van, and then the van pulled out of the parking lot and began heading north towards Fort Wayne. Fort Wayne was where the banquet hall was. It was located about an hour north. At some point during this drive north, Whitney struck up a conversation with a 22-year-old senior named Laura Van Ryn, who was sitting right next to her. Whitney and Laura were total strangers, but they looked so similar physically. They were both tall, blonde, and very slim, that when they first got onto the van, one of the other volunteers actually asked them if they were related. But it wasn't just physical similarities that Laura and Whitney shared. Once they got to talking, Whitney would learn that Laura had also grown up in a small rural Michigan town. It was called Caledonia, and it was located only a couple of hours south of Gaylord, where Whitney had grown up. After the van finally arrived in Fort Wayne, the volunteers got out, they went inside of the banquet hall building, and for the next several hours, they set up tables and chairs, they put out silverware, they hung up decorations, and the whole time, Laura and Whitney just stayed close together, continuing their friendly banter. And then around 7 p.m., when the banquet hall was ready for the next day's ceremony, the volunteers decided their work was done, and so they left the banquet hall building, they piled back into the van, and began heading south back towards their campus. For the first few minutes of the ride, Laura and Whitney would just continue to chat with each other, but pretty quickly they, like the rest of the people in the volunteer group, just were tired from all the hard work of moving things around, and so they became quiet and began looking out the window, just kind of keeping to themselves. About 30 minutes later, when the van was within a couple of miles of their campus, Whitney would turn and look next to her at Laura, just for a second, and right as she did, Laura would actually look up and look at Whitney. And so for a really quick second, they made eye contact, and so Whitney kind of awkwardly smiled at her, and as Laura was smiling back at Whitney, Whitney realized something very strange. There was this bright light on the side of Laura's face. And then seconds later, that bright light had grown, and the entire interior of the van was completely whited out. And then a second later, someone towards the front of the van yelled, "Oh my God, no!" And then the van went completely silent. Within minutes, dozens of 911 calls were coming in from motorists on I-69 saying that something terrible had happened. When first responders arrived on scene, they were braced for the worst, but even still, they were shocked at what they saw. Scattered all over the northbound and southbound lanes of I-69, not far from Taylor University, were all these huge chunks of jagged metal, there was glass everywhere, and there were bodies everywhere. That light that Whitney saw growing on Laura's face that suddenly filled the entirety of the van were the headlights of an 80,000-pound, fully loaded tractor-trailer truck driven by Robert Spencer. Robert was a truck driver, and he was traveling north on I-69 when he fell asleep at the wheel, at which point his truck veered off the road into the grassy median between the northbound side and the southbound side of I-69. His truck bounced up onto the southbound lane and crashed into Laura and Whitney's van, and when it did, the impact literally peeled off the side of their van and sent the van spinning. And so as the van is spinning, because of this huge opening in the side of it, the students inside were literally being violently thrown out of the van into traffic. When first responders finally actually began surveying the crash site, they would find Robert still in his truck, he was alive, but they would discover that of the 9 occupants inside of that van, 5 were deceased. A few hours later, in the early morning hours of April 27th, Whitney Sarik's family, back home in Gaylord, Michigan, woke up to the sound of a phone ringing. When one of Whitney's parents answered the phone, it was the Grant County coroner telling them their daughter had been in a terrible accident and she was deceased. At the same time, 3 hours south of Gaylord, Michigan, in Caledonia, Michigan, the Van Ryn family also was woken up in the middle of the night to a phone call, except the call they got was that their daughter Laura had been in that same crash, but she had survived, although she was in critical condition. In the days that followed, the Sarek family had Whitney's body transported to Gaylord, and then they began to plan for her funeral. A funeral that would have to be closed casket because of the extensive damage to Whitney's body. Meanwhile, Laura Van Ryn's family rushed to Parkview Hospital in Fort Wayne, and they would find their daughter bandaged head to toe with a neck brace on, laying in a hospital bed in a coma. Doctors would tell Laura's family that even though Laura was now stable, there was no way of knowing if she would ever come out of that coma. And even if she did, she had suffered a serious brain injury, which likely would impact her ability to function. And so knowing that at best this was going to be a very long road to recovery, Laura's family decided to move her from Fort Wayne back home to Michigan to a rehabilitation center in Grand Rapids that specialized in brain injury. And so while the Van Ryns were in the process of moving Laura back to Michigan, the Sareks were in the process of saying their final goodbyes to Whitney. On April 29th, so 3 days after the accident, the Sareks would hold a visitation in their hometown of Gaylord. A visitation is a time for friends and acquaintances to come together and pay respects and offer condolences to the people that the deceased have left behind. For Whitney's visitation, more than 1,400 people attended, which was nearly half of Gaylord's total population. The following day, on April 30th, Whitney was buried. At the same time, Laura's family, who had been taking turns keeping a 24-hour bedside vigil with Laura in the Grand Rapids facility, were given some incredible news. Based on brain scans, it looked very much like Laura would wake up from her coma, although there was no timeline. Over the next couple of weeks, Laura remained comatose, but her body would slowly begin to heal, and all signs seemed to be pointing towards her eventually making a recovery. And then on Tuesday, May 16th, so 20 days after the accident, Laura woke up from her coma. And amazingly, at first, it seemed like her brain was functioning the way it should be. The family could not believe their luck. This was a miracle. Over the next few days, Laura would slowly regain her strength to the point where she could move some limbs and she could sit up in her bed. And then as for her cognitive function, it seemed like she was making strides, but then she would do something that would make doctors and her family and everybody around her start to question if her brain really was okay. On Monday, May 22nd, so 1 week after Laura had woken up from her coma, she was sitting in her hospital bed with her physical therapist right next to her, and her family was in the room as well. And at some point, her physical therapist handed Laura a pencil, and then she put a pad of paper in front of her. And then the therapist told Laura to write a word down that was very specific. It was a word that Laura should know well, and a word that Laura should be able to spell. And so after Laura kind of gave a nod saying she understood the assignment, Laura took the pencil and very awkwardly and painstakingly wrote out a word. But when she was done and the therapist looked at what she had written, it was wrong. It didn't make any sense. And so she asked Laura to do it again. And so Laura, with even more determination, would try to write this word. And once again, she wrote the same word, the same incorrect word. And so it was at this point that the therapist and the onlooking family started to realize that, her injury to her brain might be more extensive than we thought. However, as everyone in that room would soon find out, that was not the case. There was something much, much bigger going on. Back on April 26th, just minutes after the car accident, first responders began moving about the crash site to figure out who was deceased and who was still alive. When they found Laura, she was barely clinging to life on the side of the road, and so they rushed over to her. They put her on a stretcher along with her purse, which contained her driver's license. They put that all together, they put her on an ambulance, and they sent her to the hospital. Once Laura arrived at the hospital, doctors would use her driver's license inside of her purse to identify her, and then they began wrapping her head to toe in bandages and casts. And when bandages began coming off over the following weeks, it was immediately obvious to everyone everyone that this accident had significantly altered Laura's physical appearance, most notably her teeth. They almost looked like they had been shifted to one side in her mouth. However, to Laura's family, they didn't care how she looked. They only cared that she was still alive. But on Monday, May 22nd, when Laura was handed that piece of paper and a pencil, and she was told to write her name, she did not write Laura, Laura. She wrote Whitney, Whitney. It would turn out a colossal mistake was made, and nobody caught it until that moment. The woman sitting in the hospital bed with the pencil and paper was not 22-year-old Laura Van Ryn. The woman sitting in the hospital bed was 18-year-old Whitney Sarek. When Whitney was found on the side of the road clinging to life, the first responders thought the purse next to her was hers, and so they opened it up, they found a driver's license, they looked at it, and they looked at the victim on the ground, and they looked identical, and so they said, okay, this is Laura. And amazingly, Whitney's purse that contained her driver's license happened to land on the ground next to Laura's body, and so Laura was misidentified as Whitney Sarek. A week after Whitney had written her name down on that pad of paper, it was officially confirmed that this was a case of mistaken identity. And so once again, the Sarek family received a call in the middle of the night from the Grant County coroner. Except this time, they were telling them that your daughter did not die in that car accident. She's alive. She's in Grand Rapids waiting for you. And so the Sarek family, they were completely shocked. They wanted this to be true, but it just seemed too good to be true. They had had a funeral for Whitney. They had buried Whitney. Except, because it was closed casket, they never saw Whitney. And so the Sareks hopped on a plane, they flew to Grand Rapids, and they walked into that hospital room, and there on the hospital bed was their daughter Whitney with her arms outstretched, crying, calling for her parents. Well, this, of course, was a miracle for the Sareks. It was, at the same time, a complete nightmare for the Van Ryns. They had had their suspicions that something was off about their daughter, most notably her teeth, because they just didn't look like their daughter's teeth. But they had been told by the doctors and by anybody who would talk to them that it was perfectly normal for people involved in these very significant accidents to look completely different or even act completely different. And so the Van Ryns just kind of put their suspicions to the side and focused on looking after their child and helping her recover. A few days later, Laura Van Ryn's body, which had been buried in Gaylord, Michigan under the tombstone that said Whitney Sarek, was exhumed and her body was flown to Caledonia, where the Van Ryn family was able to give their daughter a proper funeral and burial. Even though Whitney and Laura had only known each other very briefly during that volunteer event in Fort Wayne, their families would forge a bond over this shared trauma. And in 2008, 2 years after the crash, the Sareks and the Van Ryns would co-author a book about their experience in going through this horrible event from each of their perspectives. That book is called Mistaken Identity: Two Families, One Survivor, Unwavering Hope. Also that year, on April 26th, so the second anniversary of the accident, Taylor University would dedicate a prayer chapel to the 5 victims. Since the crash, Indiana has changed their state's protocols and procedures for identifying accident victims to ensure this type of mix-up can never happen again. As for Robert Spencer, the truck driver who caused the fatal accident, he would be sentenced to 4 years in prison. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please invite the like button to come over to your house for a sleepover, but then give them a bed with no pillows or blankets. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We now have a podcast called the MrBallen Podcast that puts out brand new, never before heard stories on Mondays, and we put out remasters of our best YouTube audios on Thursdays. And so again, the podcast is called MrBallen Podcast, and it's available on YouTube, on Spotify,